the day, which is Gwyneth Wilkie talking about name-rich sources on financial records. Now, Gwyneth took early retirement from an academic career in the late 1990s and followed the skills course at the Society of Genealogists. Since then, focus has broadened beyond her own family ancestry, and she's explored key pieces of legislation such as Rosie's Act and civil registration, and has written numerous articles, as well as taking part in a local U3A project, Amersham Remembers, the men who gave their lives in the Great War. She volunteers in various capacities, and she has written brief histories of a medical practice, a cinema, and a calico printing firm, and the British schools in Amersham. And for the last 2 years, she has been collecting information on the Amersham Union Workhouse. So, over to Gwyneth. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, good morning and welcome to Amersham. This area used to be known as Amersham Common until the coming of the railway. But when houses were built, the label changed to Amersham on the Hill. And recently it seems to be talked of as Top Amersham. So welcome to Top Amersham. And I don't think we can go higher than that. I've been a member of the Guild for many years now. And when I first started doing family history, so many people said to me, if you're serious about family history, you must join the Guild, that I did, and I've certainly never regretted it. It did dawn on me that the Guild is a little different from other family history societies when I first turned up at one of their events. They said, "What is your name?" So I said, "Gwyneth Wilkie." They said, "No, not your name, your name." So my talk covers an array of financial records which are name-rich. And by the way, there's a handout that goes with the talk, so you needn't worry too much about scribbling notes, I hope. These are really good hunting grounds, both for one-namers and for family historians wanting to know more about the context of their ancestors' lives. But first, I want to crave your indulgence and go a little bit off-piste. One of the glories of Buck's archives is that they have a complete copy of the Posse Comitatus, drawn up in 1798. It noted by parish every man capable of bearing arms and every person who could supply useful materiel, such as horses, wagons, carts, in case of need in the war against France. So it lists men between the ages of 18 and 45, plus a few women. It also notes Quakers, and it's undoubtedly name-rich, but not primarily to do with money. It does make fascinating reading, as it also lists those with disabilities, and I don't know where else you might find that sort of information. So for each area, possible recruits, starting with the clergy and gentry, and proceeding via the various occupations down to labourer, are listed. So a quick glance gives you a rough idea of economic activity and social structure, close to the threshold of the 19th century. The recruits' lack of military prowess was mocked by Thomas Hardy in Trumpet Major, and inevitably they've been compared to Daz's army. Now, Captain Mannering has already been claimed for Whitby, but I think Bucks has a really good candidate for Corporal Jones, so please meet John Barnett of Western Turville. Now, family records can help by building up a picture of the world people lived in and by pinning down where they were the when. And tax lists are not comprehensive, although they do sometimes list those too poor to pay. But they may fill in gaps. For example, I know that Quartermaster Sergeant John Wilkie was in the Isle of Man several years before his body was pulled out of Douglas Harbour because he bought a dog licence. And following the money can help when more obvious records are missing. So if we take a very broad brush view of the way community affairs were run, we'll see over the course of 900 years or so, a transfer of administrative powers from local bodies to central government. And this obviously is going to affect what records are generated and where we look for them. Some jobs, such as ale taster, kind of still exist in the form of trading standards, and the office of parish constable, a temporary role once held for a year by a member of the community, evolved into a full-time job by the middle of the 19th century. The church had its own courts and granted probate until the state took over in 1858, and care of the poor switched from maybe monastery to parish to state. The surnames and the sense of a label passed down to the next generation rather than just a tag applied to an individual date from around the 14th century. So early records can be really useful for the history of surnames, but most of us won't manage to track our actual ancestors that far back. So I've concentrated on more recent sources. Even so, I'd like to start with one of the oldest types of record. It's very easy to assume that manorial records can't be relevant to us. But copyhold tenancies and the granting of leases for 3 lives were only abolished by the Law of Property Act in 1922. So I spent some time working on the history of the Griffin Inn at Bowden, Cheshire. It was entwined with the history of the more upmarket pub next door, the Stamford Arms. And I began to suspect that there could be some relationship between one of the landlords, Thomas Howard, and another Howard family from Stockport, having noticed that a William Howard of Stockport was brought back for burial in Bowden in 1829. But it was very difficult to push that theory any further because there were so many local Howard families. Happily, the leases for 3 lives being granted by the Earl of Stamford mentioned names, relationships, and even ages for the various people involved, and with these clues it was easy to draw up a reliable tree. So surprisingly, we discovered that manorial records can be helpful even as late as the 19th century. Mark Forrest's recently published book is a really good guide. Paola Sambrook has produced a superb book. It's closely based on household and estate accounts and set in a context of local social and economic history. It's a great example of how somebody prepared to tackle difficult and detailed records can bring the past to life. Among the accounts are references to gratuities paid to Peter Fletcher at the Griffin as sexton of the church. And it shows the Griffin was a place where business got done and rents were paid. And it's always worth keeping an eye on the local big house and its records. A huge amount of work has recently gone into examining estate records, and they can include rent rolls, maps, correspondence, invoices, etc. What you can find quickly depends very much on how well catalogued the documents are and whether this goes down to name level. Remember that before digitization, a lot of information was stored in ring binders or index cards, and these may still be available within the record offices. Estate records may not turn up where you expect. In this case, they were not far away, but at the John Rylands Library in Manchester rather than in Cheshire Archives. Many of the wealthy families held land in several counties, plus a house in London. As these were sold off, the muniments may have gone to a remaining house several counties away. And when I got interested in a Catholic family in London, the records turned out to be in Gloucestershire. The Griffin also features in the maps and notebooks drawn up in 1838 for the tithe commissioners. This is another way of finding out who the landowner was, and that information can lead you to a lot more. The pop-up flag shows you the name of the ultimate landowner, the Earl of Stamford and Warrington. And the accompanying notebook specifies leases for lives. These maps don't cover all areas because many tithe commutations had already been agreed. But usefully, the tithe maps were generally drawn within a few years of the 1841 census. And later on, we have the 1910 land valuation maps, the Lloyd George Doomsday, just before the 1911 census. The Griffin was previously known as the Sexton House. So now that we've strayed into church matters, let's have a look at another form of record going an awful long way back. Churchwardens' accounts. They provide a window on the parish. I suppose we think of a parish as what? A division of the Church of England? But for family historians, it's also helpful to see it as a unit of local government. After the dissolution of the monasteries and the decline of manorial power, encouraged by the Tudors, many functions became the business of the vestries, and they appointed the church wardens, overseers of the poor, parish constables, etc. Many of us shy away from looking at them because they're difficult to read and look horribly boring. But as with Dunham Massey, accounts can be the way into a lost world. They're usually name-rich and may reveal glimpses into people's lives. Some are elaborately presented, and others just scrawled. So these are rich resources, especially for periods of turbulence and transition, such as Tudor times or the Civil Wars. And here we see carpenters taking down the rood screen, only to have to put it back and take it down again, as Edward VI was followed by Mary and then Elizabeth. And many such records have been transcribed and published by record societies, but most later ones have still hardly been looked at or catalogued in any sort of detail. The parish chest was also used as the local safe deposit, and many deeds and records of charities may be found there. This had to be a sure coffer with 2 locks and 2 keys kept by different people, and later on that was beefed up to 3 locks and 3 people. The job of the church wardens was to collect dues and donations and to pay parish outgoings. And looking at these very local records, we're likely to bump into unfamiliar words. If it's unfamiliar, we know to look it up. But familiar words can be extremely treacherous, and sometimes you get a shock. The church wardens of Hope in Derbyshire in 1689 paid for 19 ravens' heads, 6 shillings and 4pence, paid for 154 urchin heads, £1, 5 shillings and 8pence. But this wasn't a ruthless form of birth control. It's just Middle English for hedgehog. And jargon is often used, so we crave allowance for Widow Twankey. Doesn't mean we'd like to give her some money, but we haven't collected her due contribution, so it's not in these accounts. This slide shows how the various authorities and jurisdictions fitted together in Wigington in the 18th century. The parish officials might be acting on decisions made by manorial courts, by magistrates, or quarter sessions, as well as by the ecclesiastical authorities. And while the parish constable served for a year, the parish clerk and sexton tended to be a bit more permanent. Bastardy bonds show how some of these records overlap. As you can see, there are a number of places to look for bastardy records, and some may contain details that others don't. Now, this bond dates from 1770 and is from the parish chest. The baby's father, John Cable, a local surgeon, had been tracked down and made to swear that he would pay £1 towards the expenses of the birth and lying in, and 8pence per week thereafter for the maintenance of the child about to be born. And we'll catch up again with this child later when we reach bankruptcy. So a lot of work may already have been done for us by historians interested in financial records for their own purposes, but as well as the Victoria County history, it's worth checking publications of local societies. Many volumes are now online. Also, if you can, visit the libraries attached to the National Archives, Society of Genealogists, County Archives, or Local Studies units. And it's great if you can just wander around the shelves. University libraries, such as those at Warwick and the London School of Economics in particular, have very useful collections. So here you can see, I think, how rapidly these account books start to reveal human stories. We have a poor orphan child starting an apprenticeship, probably just domestic labour. But then Anne Fox is persuaded to say who fathered her child, and the journey is presumably to a magistrate to get an order to apprehend Jonathan Edge, who is also hauled before a magistrate and then banged up all night until he can be taken to Eccleshall to get a licence so that the pair can be hastily married. At least he's given a portion, and some celebration is indulged in. And you can find other instances of forced marriages in these records and in many justicing notebooks. Thomas Turner, as overseer of the poor in East Hoathly, Sussex, had in 1757 to compel George Hyland of a neighbouring parish to marry Anne Durrant so that she and her child should not be chargeable to East Hoathly. Hyland professed himself willing to marry her, while at every stage failing to cooperate. By the time he capitulated, he'd gained £6 10 5 stone of beef, the cost of a marriage licence, a wedding ring worth 10 shillings for his bride, plus bell ringing and a wedding feast. And in contrast, the takings in poor old Turner's drapery shop were badly down that week. The parish officials had very wide powers when it came to poor relief, and at Westbourne they felt it was worth investing sums of money to enable parishioners to earn their own living and so get them off the books. And that looks both humane and financially hard-headed. To establish settlement, which parish had the duty of supporting someone, claimants would undergo an examination. This one is about John Joynson, who fell on hard times. And here there's no actual mention of money, but make no mistake, this process is all about money. Aged 47, he got stranded in London. Formerly as a postilion employed by Lord Cholmondeley of Cheshire, he'd earned 6 shillings and 5 a week. And then he worked as a cabbie, but he lost his sight. And I don't know of any other way of finding this sort of information. It was indexed in SOG data online, and the original is in Westminster Archives. So the outcome of a settlement examination might be a certificate of settlement, complete with wax seals and several signatures. This allowed you to seek work in another parish, or it might result in a removal order instructing the parish constable to start shifting you back to your parish of settlement. The high point of vestry powers was in the 1830s, just before the change to the new Poor Law of 1834, which was centrally administered and designed to rein back spending on the relief of the poor. By this time, vestries were raising and spending the equivalent of 1/5 of the entire budget for the government. And there was what looks like almost a media campaign to expose corrupt select vestries and to present them in general as profligate, inefficient, and self-serving, and therefore ripe for replacement. So here's a website which has been set up to compile information about church wardens' accounts and their survival in each parish. So church wardens' accounts are all about a locality, and other taxes were levied nationally. One good starting point for these is E179 database on the National Archives website. This aims to list surviving taxation records from the 13th century to 1689 and is searchable by place. It includes things like lay subsidies. These capture quite a wide swathe of the population up to the mid-16th century, but after that the threshold for liability was set a lot higher. And before 1536, these records refer only to England. After that, they include Wales. You may find that northern ancestors are less well represented in early tax records. When money was being raised for fighting the Scots, they were already on the spot and could make direct contributions of arms and horses instead of paying taxes. And many powers were devolved to the Palatinates of Durham, Lancaster, and Chester, and those records can be found at the National Archives. And also, parishes in the north were often huge. Kendal had 15 chapelries, so dues were collected for preference through the townships, not the parish. Most of these things can only be seen at TNA, but just occasionally notes or drafts made by local officials will turn up in county archives. And E179 mentions foreigns, by which I assume it means immigrants. So these early tax records are certainly very useful for the evolution of surnames and for tracking immigrants, and thus perhaps how certain surnames came to be. This website brings together a huge amount of information, and we can see that some of their immigrants ended up in Amersham. So not all records are as detailed as others, but with luck will contain the names of proprietors, names of occupiers, houses and lands, and then the amount they pay. And again, you may pick up leads to other documents. So going on to hearth tax, this was imposed between 1662 and 1689. 2 shillings per hearth had to be paid each year, half on Lady Day, half at Michaelmas. And therefore, of course, many people simply bricked up their windows to avoid paying. So many helpful guides have been published, and the Gibson guides in particular are always worth looking at for their pithy introductions written with family historians in mind. And some of those are on the side table over there. For hearth tax, do look at this website developed by the universities of Roehampton and Graz, which has a lot of useful information. And it is searchable both by name and place. And from these you can get a rough idea about somebody's relative prosperity in an area. Now these may look quite long lists, but I can assure you that much lengthier and more detailed ones are to be found on Family Search and also Brigham Young University's English Ancestors pages. These are excellent reference points showing you what taxes were being levied between what dates. So next, I'd like to move on to the various websites to see what is easily available to us and what the records look like. But do be aware that new resources keep being added, and more treacherously, of course, they may suddenly be withdrawn with no fanfare. Sometimes the indexes remain online. So on websites, searches need to be rerun occasionally. Archive catalogues are very much less fitful. Most taxes nationally were levied in times of war, but in war or peace, local and county rates also had to be paid, covering such things as scavenging, that's street cleaning, poor rates, and later on, maintenance of the highway. So here we can see what's on Find My Past if we search under taxes in all record sets. Change that to rates, you find a bit more. And this is similar thing for ancestry, and you'll see that land tax records feature very prominently on this site. And it's always, of course, worth trying Januki plus Family Search in their wiki and also under catalogue and books. So here's an example of what some of these records look like. Land tax began as a wider tax on property, and then it concentrated on land holdings which were harder to conceal. Each county was told how much it had to contribute, and then the money was collected from the towns and parishes. So this was levied from 1689 in succession to hearth tax, and it continued actually until 1952. But the records survived best between 1780 and 1832. Why? Well, because from 1780, duplicate records were sent to the Clerk of the Peace and used to establish who had the right to vote. So they may be found amongst the Quarter Sessions records. And therefore, if somebody is in the poll books, you might like to find a bit more out about them from the land tax records and vice versa. The National Archives at IR23 has all the returns for England and Wales in 1798. And it was then possible to pay 15 years' contributions in one go and free yourself from future obligations. So these land tax redemption records are held in IR 22, 23 and 24, and Ancestry has IR 23. And it's, I'm afraid, not been terribly well indexed, but you can, as far as names go, but you can search it by place. In specialized libraries, useful material may exist only in TypeScript. So searching under tax in the SOG catalogue, and by the way, you don't need to be a member to do that, produces 159 hits. And increasingly, SOG is digitizing its most fragile and/or unique records, and to use them you need to be a member or else to pay a fee. But be warned, the tax on men servants lists only employers and not those employed. There's a bit about it. The time of the Civil War is often referred to by family historians as the Commonwealth Gap. Political and religious turmoil meant that many people moved away from their homes and may even have spent time in exile abroad. Churches were looted, so many items, including books, were wrecked or burnt. Registers were hidden, and at the Restoration, some parsons refused to accept records which had been created by the parish register, so-called, or the minister who had replaced them. But recently, a website has been set up to bring some information out of this chaos. There's a helpful introduction, which you can download, and I think these are pretty impressive statistics. Most of the early petitioners were on the parliamentarian side. You also get some mentions of their dependents, which is very handy. And then after the Restoration, you get more royalists seeking help. The series IR1 is an excellent tool. It lists stamp duty paid on apprenticeship indentures between 1710 and 1711. The tax actually stopped in 1811, that should have been, in 1804, but they went on, where late payments were due, they were paid. So this lists the names of masters and their apprentices, and it's now readily searchable on Ancestry. IR1 is an index, but frankly, not much more information can be gleaned by digging further. It's not complete because when parish officials managed to apprentice poor children, no duty was payable, but you might find something in the churchwarden's accounts. Nor was duty levied on placements within families, and this would no doubt include many medical and legal placements because they were the most expensive. So here you get the date duty was paid, the name of the master, the place, the trade, and lastly, the name of the apprentice. And outside these dates, it's worth looking at other collections such as SOG's Crisp's apprenticeship indentures, and then Trinity House petitions and the Board of Trade records are useful for seamen, and it's always worth checking county archives and local charities. And as you can see here, the third one down, Ancestry has a Freedom of the City of London index, and that should remind us that many guilds and corporations up and down the country also have admissions registers, sometimes with really good genealogical detail. Now, obviously, taxes were very unpopular, as many cartoons attest, and this is a humorous protest against the hat tax. That was a way of raising revenue in accordance with a person's deemed wealth. A rich person would own a large number of more expensive hats, or indeed horses, carriages, silver, men servants, lots of other things. But note that the figure here is wearing a red hat, rather like those used to depict revolutionaries in France. Successive governments were afraid of provoking revolution in this country, but when it came to taxation, they probably agreed with Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Louis XIV's finance minister. The art of taxation consists in so plucking the goose as to obtain the largest possible amount of feathers with the smallest amount of hissing. Nor could taxation be avoided after you were dead, which brings us to the death duty records. And these are much underused simply because they're difficult to locate and read, but they can serve you really well. It's best to use the National Archives Research Guide, as the way to approach them keeps changing. IR26 works like a digest. It ditches all the legal terminology of a will to tell you quite simply who got what. You get the date of death and the names of the executors. And with lifetime annuities, clerks often added a note that tells you when the annuitant died. So IR26 is the index to IR27 is the index to IR26. It tells you where the will was probated. Now, the estate had to be large enough for duty to be paid, so it doesn't catch everyone who left a will. But in your notes, you'll find a proportion of roughly what percentage paid duty between what dates. So, let's see how that can help. William Harrison had quite a common name. He was away from home when the 1841 census was taken, and he died in 1849, so he dodged having to declare his age and birthplace in the 1851 census. He had a brother, Jeremiah, but that name seemed to be almost more frequent in Lancashire than William. Find My Past has the index entry from IR27, and while the transcript is vague about where the will was probated, the real entry, as you can see, specifies Chester. So you then need to note down that very faint folio 841 in the last column. It's hardly legible. But with that, you can chase things further. And I'm afraid things often fizzle out at this point. But for him, you can see that we get details of the executor, Jeremiah Harrison, including his date of death, plus an address for another relative. And that's quite enough to identify this family clearly and take it back several more generations with very little effort. I recently went to see the death duty records linked to the 1842 probate of Thomas Marshall of Amersham. The film at TNA was utterly useless. It was just a sea of black with a few vertical scratches where the M and double L might have been. But Dave Annell told me that Family Search had also filmed these records up to 1857, and their image, which you can get in any affiliate library or Mormon Family History Center, was excellent. Now, estates of people who died holding government stocks had to go through the Prerogative Court of Canterbury and then be listed in the Bank of England will extracts. PCC, close by in Doctors' Commons, was the top probate court with the most experienced probate lawyers. For 1717 to 1845, there are approximately 60,500 records. And mostly they're extracts of wills with those who died with monies in the public funds. But you will also find abstracts of orders made for stockholders who went bankrupt or were declared lunatic. And all social conditions are there, from servant girls to noblemen. Fundholders came from all over the British Isles and the colonies, and in fact several hundred Dutch fundholders are there as well. And these registers, it's said, are one of the best sources for Georgian biographical and genealogical information to have become available in recent years. But let's see what happened when the money ran out. A good hunting ground is the London Gazette, a journal of record where official notices were published and then often copied in local newspapers. Up to 1861, there's a crucial difference between being a bankrupt or an insolvent debtor. Debtors could go to prison, like the unfortunate Robert Joynson, while bankrupts compounded with their creditors and paid them a so-called dividend of maybe 12 shillings in the pound if they were lucky. This might be done in several stages and over several years. And sometimes the word dealer and chapman are used. All that means is that they were in a business of some sort. It's a tag, like with force and arms, which signals that somebody is breaching the king's peace, and it doesn't mean that they were actually armed. And Paul Blake's book will tell you a huge amount more. So now bankruptcy, and sadly we're following Cable Ainsworth, whose imminent birth provoked the bastardy bond. The London Gazette carried several announcements about his calico printing business, with partnerships being formed and dissolved. Unfortunately for this new enterprise, in 1825 financial panic swept Lancashire. This resulted from problems over South American debt and led to the failure of 70 banks. And when a large bank, Wentworth & Co. of Wakefield, failed in December 1825, the impact of that on the Manchester markets is vividly recalled by Archibald Prentice. In Manchester, the circulation of provincial notes was instantaneously stopped. Everyone hastened to pay away what he had, but nobody would receive them, and every note except those which were payable there and which were exchanged for gold till long past the usual banking hours became, for the first time, nothing more than waste paper. In the corn market, business was almost entirely suspended. Cheese, which had been weighed out by the ton for country shopkeepers, was put back again when it was found that the buyers had nothing to pay with other than country paper. So coins and banknotes at this time were in very short supply. Local banks could issue their own notes. Suppliers and manufacturers often paid each other using promissory notes or bills of exchange, and they functioned rather like post-dated checks. You could trade them before the due date for a bit less than the sum specified. But essentially, this created a pyramid of debt, making otherwise sound businesses vulnerable. And banks outside London were not allowed to have more than 6 owners, so they might not have large currency reserves to draw on, and also were very local, which made it hard to spread the risk. Thus, country paper could lose its value very quickly in a crisis, or even just a rumour of a crisis, and tokens got used instead of coins. But conversely, the South Sea bubble showed how quickly shares could rise in value on a wave of unrealistic forecasts. So both Cable's ironmongery and Calico printworks had to go, but the printworks was refinanced and went on as Ainsworth, Sykes & Co. Now, I sometimes think that family history causes a strange perversion of values. Having a convict in the family is great because you learn so much about them. And similarly, bankruptcy must have been utterly horrendous, but it can tell us a lot. So here we have a partnership between my ancestor John Joynson and his brother William and brother-in-law Richard Lewis being dissolved. Then 8 months later, the firm went bust. Without this notice, I would not have known where they were operating. It's worth searching local newspapers for more details and widening the dates. This advert appeared a month before the notice in the Gazette, and sometimes disposals went on for years. And this reveals a lot about their other corn mill at Blakely, 4 miles out of Manchester. The equipment is listed, and the mill also has a dwelling house and 14 acres of land. Details are given of the lease and the rent and so on, so there might be more in an archive somewhere. And we even get a pretty good hint about how the business failed. The mill has lately been put into a complete state of repair at considerable expense, and the mill dam very much enlarged so as to ensure a constant supply of water. So a lot of capital had been ploughed in, and they seem to have suffered from inadequate cash flow. So we now, just from that, know a lot about this business, which Had the business not failed, we wouldn't know. And now let's look at insurance, which will take us in the direction of fraud and even murder. Marine insurance came first. Those records start in the 16th century. The earliest surviving fire insurance date from 1680-ish, and then life insurance came along rather later. The Great Fire of London, as you can imagine, was a highly effective marketing tool. It gave a great boost to fire insurance. And insurance companies from the beginning were involved in crime prevention and prosecution. And they provided fire engines, and they needed to know where to send those fire engines, so you get street maps. Maps of Manchester produced by Goad in the mid-1880s have incredible detail, and several other large cities were involved. And the houses had marks, plaques on the wall showing which company they were with. So the Sun Fire Insurance has the largest archive of continuous records, and you can see more than 380,000 policies between 1782 to 1842. They've been indexed. And historians of industry may sometimes get details of vanished buildings from such records. But please don't be misled into thinking that they feature people only living in London. You can see many other places represented. Most of the records ended up in London because that's where companies had their headquarters. But their agents were everywhere, so it may pay to look in a local directory to see which companies had agents in your area. And this shows the situation in Kendal from the 1834 Pigot's directory. What are your chances of finding anything? Well, by the late 18th century, around 36% of the gentry held policies, about 22% of professional people, and around 20% of inns were insured. And Hawkins points out that landed gentry often listed farms and property in great detail, so this brings in the names of tenants. But not all the records are in London either. Records of the Phoenix Insurance Company are at Cambridge University Library. And as you can see, there's a terribly complex picture of takeovers, mergers, and name changes, but Hawkins has done a huge amount of work on it. And local index of policyholders can now be found in Shropshire archives and also in Doncaster, so that may be a trend to watch. Insurance records may capture a person with a far-off dwelling place, in this case Rome. They still want to insure the property they hold, even when they go a long way away. Dates of death of policyholders and sometimes executors are noted, so you get further clues. And they may help to find people who simply disappear from the records. And Hawkins said, the combined insurance policy records create what might be described as a huge directory of the country. They give the names and addresses of much of the population, from labourers to landed gentry, and cover a period starting over 300 years ago and 140 years before the first useful population census. So you may have heard of burial club frauds. Burial clubs were started to help people put aside money to cover funeral costs. By contributing small amounts each week, you could avoid the humiliation of a pauper's funeral. And you might not stop at one club. Register with 2, and you not only covered the funeral, but you had a lump sum to do something with. The ability to register a death and obtain a certificate without actually having to produce a body appealed to cunning minds, and a number of frauds were uncovered. And from this, you can see that both Punch and the Times were aware by the mid-century of such temptations and also the ready availability of poisons. So here, arsenic is being told to a little girl whose dad was enrolled in a burial club. It ends with Bottles the pharmacist saying, "Ha, a pretty good morning's work. And if the undertakers don't get a job or two out of it, and perhaps Jack Ketch, that's the hangman, I shall be astonished." But as time went on, regulations were tightened by the Registrar General and by some insurance companies. The Registration Act of 1874 meant that a medical certificate should be produced in order to register a death. So things were getting a bit tougher. But two determined women, the sisters Margaret Higgins and Catherine Flanagan, were undeterred, and you can read their astonishing story in this book by Angela Brabin. They went to trial on 4 counts of murder, which included the son of one and the husband of the other. There were another 6 possible murders where the evidence was less strong, and a further 7 featured in local gossip. So, this was a business model which had been refined over time. Poison was easy to come by. Soaking flypapers produced a solution of arsenic. Producing a body doesn't seem to have been a problem once an expendable member of the family or a gullible lodger had been identified. Most difficult of all was getting somebody to insure their life with several companies without arousing their suspicions. Thomas Higgins refused to play ball with one company, so an accomplice who would pretend to be him had to be found, and this is what led to their undoing. The man from the Pearl brought round to the house the claim form while the body of Thomas Higgins was still on the premises, and he realized that the corpse and the man who'd been presented to him as the person to be insured were not the same. But let's look closely at the figures. Paying out 1 shilling and 4 a month for a short while could get you £50, and that's more than 2 years' wages for a labourer. So where else could you get such returns? Angela Brabin is convinced that the sisters were part of a large network of women who were aware of this road to financial success. So now I'd like to leave the records and think about the cost of living. It's really hard to know what sums of money are worth at different dates. So it's worth collecting data whenever you can. Sir Frederick Morton Eden's study of the Poor Laws and Family Budgets, on the table over there, came out in 1797, giving much information about districts and people's lives. He names no names, but we may find families comparable to ours. From the 1830s, some useful statistics are given in the first annual report of the Poor Law Commissioners. These concern families who'd been offered the chance to move from parishes in Buckinghamshire, where jobs were hard to come by, to Cheshire or Lancashire, where factory hands were needed. William Bailey had 8 children. He was employed on the roads by the parish. The family's weekly income was 16 shillings, of which 1 shilling went on rent for a grotty cottage. But having moved to Staley Bridge, they do pay more in rent, 2 shillings and 6pence, but together they can bring in 42 shillings and 6pence per week, and they say they're well treated and have plenty of food. Victorian London is a website with a lot of useful data, and they quote their sources so you can follow them up easily. Maud Pember Reeves studied the budgets of family in Lambeth, where the man was in steady work in the early 1900s. And she was actually a member of the Women's Fabian group and also a friend of Sydney and Beatrice Webb. So we can find out instances of what people were paid or what they had, but what were those sums worth at the time? So here we have several tools to help us make sense of things. This is the National Archives one, which is great. It works from 1270, but only gives the equivalent up to 2017, and infuriatingly it hasn't been updated beyond that. The Bank of England's inflation calculator is also very good and straightforward, and that goes back a little further to 1209. And the results you get using both of those do differ slightly because different databases are being used, a bit like DNA. The most sophisticated is probably measuring worth, which covers several different currencies and allows you a choice of databases. It has price index versus average earnings, for example. So this slide shows that we've by no means exhausted this subject, and I can think of many things that haven't been mentioned or indeed listed here, inventories, for example, and I'm sure you can suggest others. But I feel I've probably exhausted your patience, so thank you for listening, and I'll try and answer any questions you have.
Wow, thank you. Am I on? Yes. Thank you very much. That was very interesting. A question for myself. The Posse Comitatus, what is the survival like in other counties? Do you know?
I know it's incomplete, and I think actually not many counties are involved. I think it could be 4 or 5 only who've actually lodged their records. But I think, you know, we'd need to look in each county archives. It's very much a local record, not a national one. So
I must admit, I did sneak a quick search on the Suffolk archives and just got a big question mark. Okay, any questions from the audience? One in the front row there.
I've got an observation rather than a question. When you use the word foreign, my ears pricked up, but you immediately said it was people from abroad.
yes,
Well, in Warsaw, I've looked at the Warsaw archives. Warsaw in Staffordshire is split into 2 parts, the Warsaw Borough and the Warsaw Foreign.
mm-hmm.
So the foreign is used in administrative purposes as well, not just for people who lived abroad.
Thank you very much for that. What date was that?
1660.
Thank you, that's really useful. I wasn't sure what to make of it, frankly.
The original documents are in Warsaw archives. We did a study of them. It was for an army tax.
Right. Fine. I did want to show you that website anyway, even if I didn't quite understand the route into it, because it's just got so much, you know, terrific stuff on it.
Thank you for that. Any other questions from the audience? Yes? Oh, 2 over there.
Just very quickly on the foreign, there's Reigate Foreign Registration District as well.
Thank you. I've clearly got a lot of work to do when I get home now. Yes, or stranger was.
Am I on? Yes. You said in a very excellent presentation, you said, and given a lot of references, you said there'll be a handout. How will we obtain the handout? Will that be on the Guild website, or is it something we take away with us today?
I don't know, but I'm handing it over to.
Okay, thank you.
It's rather a lengthy one because it's got not only the references to this, but also I've suggested things if you want to pursue any of the categories further.
That's very kind. Thank you very much there. Oh, another question over there. Thank you.
I've been recently trying to find something about an ancestor who's got a foreign sounding name, and I wondered if it was Huguenot. But on the probate, his widow said he was a yeoman. And I wondered, does yeoman mean he had land? And I just wondered if that was a way that I could search maybe for where he came from.
Yes, I mean, yeoman usually means somebody who's a sort of freeholder of land, doesn't it? And they would have various rights that went with that. So I suppose, you know, if you can get any detail about the land that he had, worth looking for. And what was the surname, by the way? Rosier. Oh, right. Groszier. Sounds French, doesn't it? Yes. But I lived North Yorkshire, Northallerton. I did look at the land tax records, thinking if he was a yeoman, maybe he had land, but I couldn't find anything. No. No. Yes. I think for a while it's one of these sort of aspirational titles, so it gets stretched a bit. You know, lots of people claim to be yeoman and it becomes a more elastic term altogether. But there was also quite a lot of inflow from the Netherlands, you know, and other places, not necessarily just after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes.
It's Peter Copsey. The Guild has purchased a number of hearth tax books produced by the British Record Society, transcriptions of sort of quite thick volumes of hearth tax. These are available for the members to request a lookup on these books. The lookup request will go to various people who hold those books at the moment. I hold quite a few, but other members of the Guild hold them. If you go to the lookup index on the Guild website, you'll find the hearth tax that we hold there. Thank you.
Thank you, that's very, very useful.
You mentioned insolvency, which I'm quite interested in. One of my Kembles, I found an advert, not an advert, a request in the paper. Kemble, I won't mention his name, was missing in 1800, and there was a £5 reward. So fair amount of money at that stage. I subsequently found out he went to London to a bankruptcy hearing, but the insolvency records are mainly missing. I think there's only about 10% of them available. Is there anything else I can do to find out information about this individual?
I suppose possibly if he did get nabbed, he might show up in prison records. Local newspapers, Police Gazette maybe, less likely. What date was it?
1811, I think. I found the bankruptcy.
So local.
I got the date of the hearing, but no record of it, no detailed record of it. He did subsequently come back, so I do know he didn't go to prison.
Yeah. So I really don't know, I'm afraid. It's a matter of keeping digging, really. In 1811, local newspapers didn't do much in the way of local events, did they? It was largely national and so on.
Any other questions? Okay. Thanks very much then, Gwyneth. We just put our hands together. We have a short break now, comfort break. Take a stretch.